On today's show, we'll be talking about an area critical for national security. My guest is Ambassador Susan Stevenson, retired. She'll talk about what a career in diplomacy looks like, feels like, and in truth is from the ground experience. She'll answer the question, is diplomacy really all it's cracked up to be? Thank you for joining me today. I'm Madelyn Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about unlocking the resilient leader in you. 25 years ago, I worked with 4 ambassadors who participated in the creation of a documentary that highlighted some of their diplomatic careers. From meetings with high officials to talking with school children, the human stories were real, human, and spoke to the quiet power of diplomacy. Through this process, I realized that I didn't really understand what diplomats do. Since then, I have done research, held additional interviews with diplomats, presented at foreign services, and felt I was just beginning to understand what the State Department did to serve the American people. What that said to me was that it takes a bit of doing to come to any understanding of a service that is best done quietly in the background. So when I met my guest, I immediately invited her to talk with me, and she graciously said yes. But before I tell you about her, it's important to know that just as our presidents are known for the rest of their lives, always as Mr. President, an ambassador retains the title even after retiring or leaving active service. So with that, Ambassador Susan N. Stevenson enjoyed a 3-decade career as a diplomat, serving twice as Chief of Mission, and that's Ambassador to the Republic of Equatorial Guinea from 2019 to 2021, and Chargé d'Affaires to Myanmar, 2023 to 26, and in leadership positions in the State Department in Washington. She also served abroad in Thailand, mainland China, Hong Kong, and Mexico. Before joining the Foreign Service, Ambassador Stevenson worked in product management at the Kellogg Company, including as category brand manager for Kellogg's France. She earned dual degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, my old alma mater, in multinational management at the Wharton School, and French, the College of Arts and Sciences. Without further ado, Ambassador Stevenson, welcome to Unlocked.
Thank you so much, Madelyn. It's an honor to be here.
It is a pleasure for us to have you here. You know, I am always curious about what draws people to their work. You know, what drew you eventually to diplomacy of all things?
Without going too far back, but I was first drawn to cross-cultural communication on a childhood trip to Canada, French-speaking Canada, because we were in Montreal and I heard people speaking French to each other, a language I did not understand, and that ignited in me a desire to learn foreign languages. And I was really motivated by cross-cultural communication. So I did a junior year abroad at Penn through the Reed Hall program with Columbia University in Penn. And then I worked overseas with Kellogg's for a year, trying to see if being a international business person would scratch that itch. And I found it didn't. I wanted to do something more meaningful. And therefore, I'd heard about the Foreign Service, which I didn't know was a profession. When we were at university, I had thought maybe there was an ambassador at an embassy overseas, but I had no idea that there was a whole professional staff. And so I took the Foreign Service exam and then embarked upon this career. And I think the best part of the career is you go in thinking that you might be a specialist in one area and you end up in somewhere completely different. So I went in as a fluent French speaker and ended up a China hand and an East Asian hand.
It's interesting. I remember when I finally discovered the Foreign Service. It was when they invited me to come in and speak to them. And I thought, how could I go through my whole life and not know that there was this incredible entity?
Well, exactly.
And usually, now I shouldn't. Yes, I'm going to say it anyway. There is there is a quality about the work that is done there, and you just feel it as you're working with them.
Well, because of the rigorous process by which people enter either the civil service or the foreign service,
Uh-huh.
you end up with people who are very well read. They've got a lot of extensive experience overseas. They know a lot about American society, history, policy. They are steeped subject matter experts in many cases. And
Mm.
so you're surrounded by intellectuals that bring this wealth of knowledge. It's really invigorating to work in that sort of environment.
I agree. I felt exactly the same way when I worked at the World Bank
Yes.
from a similar kind of background. Yeah. Well, let's come back to diplomacy. How does diplomacy really relate to everyday America?
I think Americans might think that diplomacy is something that happens overseas and it's talk fests and it doesn't really have to do with them. But it's important for an average American in the United States for a number of reasons. First of all, it unlocks trade, which helps with our exports, our manufacturing, making local areas more prosperous because they've got that ability to export to different markets. It's safety and security. So we're seeing that now with what's going on in the Middle East. But importantly, if there are issues, you want to make sure that they're dealt with overseas and that it doesn't draw the United States into a conflict. And so we like to help try to resolve conflicts and differences when they first happen. You'll also see the United States working on developmental issues. We're seeing now with the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo back in 2014, where there was another one in more West Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. The United States played a leading role both with our scientists helping to with contact tracing and the different protocols, but also the president at the time went and did public service announcements on the radio because ironically he was more trusted than even the leaders of those countries to get people to change their behavior that help mitigate the transmission. So I think the United States has a lot to offer to prevent conflicts, diseases, et cetera, happening back in the United States. And also this economic dimension of helping promote trade and exchange will contribute to the economies in different states and localities, wherever your listeners are living.
Wow. That's a broad mandate.
Yes.
Well, in the course of creating the video that I did, I spoke about earlier, Jan Eliasson, a sitting ambassador to the U.S. at the time, and formerly an ambassador to the UN, told the story of going to Banja Luka, that in can't think of the name of the country now. I think I got changed.
In Bosnia?
That's it. That's it. Thank you. Where during the war in the Balkans, the Varaji Mosque had been blown up. And he told of going to the site afterwards and finding two pieces of rubble after digging around in the parking lot, which it had been made into. And he took those two stones and put them in his pocket. And he said this way he could prove that there had been a mosque there, regardless of it being turned into a parking lot. He said it was a story inspired by the words good neighbor and tolerance in the preamble to the Charter of the UN. You know, the U.S. has a constitution, and we have a preamble to the Constitution, which says why we have the Constitution. Well, in the UN, it's a charter, and they have a preamble. And he loved those words. And it was just a great story because those words became alive to me. In fact, he said when he found them, the interpreter almost cried. Mm. So I was wondering, I'd love to hear a true story that you might have. That you may have to remove names, whatever's necessary, but I'd love to hear a story from the ground.
Yes. And you had said at the outset that diplomacy is sometimes quiet, and there's a lot of things that we can't talk about, particularly as you're in the middle of negotiations. And I like to quote Henry Kissinger, who described diplomacy as the patient accumulation of partial successes. And I think that is definitely the right word for it, because it's a long process and it doesn't necessarily correspond to a political calendar. And so it's good if we've got broad lines of foreign policy that don't change, so that successive groups can, meaning ambassadors and leadership, can work on them. So I've been fortunate in my career, particularly working in the mainland China when I was in Beijing as the press officer, to have a front row seat on negotiations on dismantling the nuclear program of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And so I was in the room when our then Assistant Secretary, Christopher Hill, was talking with his counterpart about getting China to get back into hosting these, what we called the six-party talks. They had representatives from the Republic of Korea, obviously the DPRK, Japan, Russia, China, and then the United States. Mm-hmm. And by having the six parties in the six-party talks, it really made this an issue not just between North Korea and the United States, but the different parties that were involved on the Korean Peninsula, and particularly all of those that bordered it, and would have the most suffering if there were to be a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And what was so interesting about that is it was a marathon round of talks, particularly getting the Chinese back on board and then getting the North Koreans to make certain concessions through kind of months of patient diplomacy. And this involved our assistant secretary coming out nearly every month. So you don't see that when you're in the United States, but every month we have our top diplomat for Asia had to fly all the way to Beijing, which is about a 13-hour flight, to meet with his counterparts. And sometimes they held the meetings in other cities, but mostly it was around Beijing or northern China to talk about ways that North Korea could commit to dismantling its nuclear program. Now, when I say the patient accumulation of partial successes, of course, with our political calendar, when the Obama administration came in, their priority on the DPRK was different from that of George W. Bush. And so the rhetoric out of the Obama administration at the start of the administration, unfortunately, undid some of that good work. But that's an example. One other thing I'd like to share is that we have no higher duty than the protection of Americans, although it must be said, when you're in a foreign country, you need to abide by the laws of the foreign country. And so when I was the ambassador at the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, it came to my attention that an American citizen had been taken from a different, I'm trying to think if he was I think he was in Chad. He had been in a meeting in Chad, and the Equatorial Guineans had gone in and swept up this group of people that were meeting under suspicion that they were plotting a coup against President Teodoro Obiang, the president of Equatorial Guinea. So they brought them to the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, and we had heard this rumor that an American was among them. Well, I spent, this was probably November of 2019, and I spent the better part of a year trying to ascertain, was it an American? What happened to him? By then, when he was actually charged, it was COVID, so they weren't allowing us access. And it took me until the September of 2021 when I finally gained access and was able to go see him in person. And this person had been held basically incommunicado. He was able to speak French, but he didn't speak any Spanish, and Equatorial Guinea is a Spanish-speaking country. He had to live through COVID without anyone really explaining what is going on, except suddenly people are wearing masks everywhere. He doesn't have access to news, and he has no idea the U.S. Embassy even knows he's there. So it was very important for me to go be the first person from his country to go visit him, tell him, of course, we've been following the case the entire time, know that because the Equatorial Guineans knew that we were following the case, that he would be treated better. Now, we can't get him out of prison if he has committed a crime. So we had to follow the judicial proceedings very closely. But it's that kind of impact, just knowing that we're there to support Americans. By the same token, when Myanmar had a devastating earthquake in March of 2025, I was very proud that we were able, both I was in the Mandalay, the city at the epicenter, and there was an American there that had gone to our cultural center seeking assistance. And so we were able to evacuate him and bring him down to Yangon with us, but also sending my consular officer up to Mandalay to talk to those Americans who maybe hadn't registered with the embassy, didn't think that they needed help from the embassy, and then suddenly they had lost their life savings, which had been hidden in cash and in their apartment that collapsed, and they really needed our help. And that is very satisfying. I mean, that's ultimately what we're really there for.
Wow, 3 very powerful stories. The one that comes to my mind, though, as you're saying this, is we're in Rome, and my husband's pocket was picked and with his passport along with it, and we immediately went to the embassy.
Very good, and that's what we're there for.
I mean, that was such a simple thing, and you're telling me about somebody who is still in jail for we don't know why, and that he was incommunicado for 2 years, didn't even know. Oh, wow. Yeah. I can see why that would actually feel rewarding, even though frustrating at times, I'm sure. Wow.
And sometimes you can't solve the big problems. Like we weren't ever able to denuclearize North Korea, but you're able to make these incremental differences on the ground. And you just have to focus on those and know that in the long term, you will get bigger results.
Well, so much in management. I mean, I'm talking now about ordinary management of your team or your unit or your department. Its effectiveness is so much based on relationships and how well you develop the relationships internally, externally. And what I'm hearing you say is that's very much what diplomacy is.
It's definitely what diplomacy is. This is one of maybe the jobs that is not very ripe for artificial intelligence, because personal relationships really matter. Trust really matters, that you will get more because you have interacted with people, and it's best to do this before there's a crisis.
Right.
And I did the same in Equatorial Guinea, as we hadn't had a lot of contact with the head of the security because of worries about human rights issues, which are very real and valid. But we also had a big challenge with maritime security because we have big gas and oil investment, American companies there, and there's a lot of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. And so we need to be on a continual communication basis with the Equatorial Guineans as well. And because my predecessors were reluctant to engage, we didn't have that kind of relationship with the ministries of defense and national security. And so you do have to reach out, talk to people. We might not agree with them, but it is important to at least listen to their point of view and communicate ours. And it does help people understand our policies better too.
Yeah. Well, somewhat related, actually. This question has to do with the fact that the Secretary of State has actually been held by women. Madelyn Albright, Hillary Clinton. So, and this is actually the number. That's the Secretary of State becomes president very quickly after, as a succession, as I recall.
Well, it's because the State Department was the first federal agency. And so in the line of succession, I think it's the president, vice president, the Speaker of the House, all the elected officials. And then you come down, the first cabinet member is the Secretary of State.
Okay.
And you forgot Condoleezza Rice.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Oh,
yes.
I know. It's funny, when I wrote it, I said, I know there's another one. Thank you. So how did you find it being a woman in the diplomatic service? I mean, was it different, for example, from your experience in the private sector?
Yes. The private sector has a profit imperative, and so is going to be less risk averse. So when I worked for Kellogg's, I made it known when I first joined that I really wanted to work abroad. And the first person among our cohort that they sent overseas was a male colleague of mine that they sent to Korea. And I had to go march in and remind my boss, I wanted to go overseas. Why wasn't I considered? And the answer was, oh, you're a woman. We didn't think you'd be as successful because it's a very male dominated culture. Then another colleague was sent to be the regional head of Asia Pacific based in Australia. Again, I went in and said, hey, I wanted to go overseas. And again, I was told, oh, well, we didn't think you would be as effective in Asia. So when I first joined the Foreign Service, I asked during our training, introductory training, are you going to do that to me? And they said, no, we want to show America. And so we're going to put people in, prominent positions all over the world, regardless. And so that is true that we have, we had a special delight in having a Black ambassador to South Africa during apartheid years, and sending women ambassadors to Pakistan, and of course, where they've had a female prime minister too. But I found, to my great satisfaction, that being a woman in the Foreign Service didn't hold me back from career progression or my own government. Now, it is true that you have to overcome prejudices in the local communities. And so in Equatorial Guinea, I was asked, why did the United States send a female ambassador? And I had to say, well, they chose the best person for the job. And then in certain times when I was working in China, I had male, like the head of Xinhua News Agency, counterparts treating me like I was a cute little thing, trying to sort of negate my role. And you just have to ignore that and continue to do your job. So I'm reminded of my ambassador when I was in Thailand, the great Christy Kinney. She came in at a time when WikiLeaks first hit. And so she was trying to describe it's like having your notebook stolen and people saw your private notes, and that's not a good thing. But the way the newspaper articles were written were a little bit condescending. And I would ask her, doesn't that drive you crazy? They're trying to treat you again like this, sweet young thing when you're the ambassador, darn it. And she said, if they want to do that, that's fine. It really taught me that she was so secure in her own abilities that she didn't let it bother her, and she kept her head down and just did a good job. And so I have used that as my guide as well. If you ever encounter prejudice as a woman, it's the other person's problem, not yours. And you just keep going and do the job as effectively as possible.
In all of my research, I would affirm that. It's very clear that women who know who they are and what they bring to the table work from that perspective. Yeah.
Yes. And after a while, you're not seen as,
correct,
a woman or whatever. You get beyond the characterization to just your own competent self.
Yeah. Well, speaking of your experience from the private sector, did you bring anything from the private sector into your diplomatic work?
Definitely. When I joined the U.S. Information Agency, which at the time was very focused on press and cultural affairs. And so my cohort of people who joined the same time as me were mostly English teachers or lawyers. And so there was a real dearth of management, the ability to prioritize, kind of pithy communication that you learn in the private sector. And also I had fabulous management experience, supervisory experience, because I had been working not only in the United States, but then I worked a year in France. So I knew how to manage people from other cultures too, through trial and error and just my own instincts and experience. And in both USIA and then the State Department, we didn't really have any kind of supervisory or leadership training until Colin Powell was our Secretary of State after, it was probably around 2002. And so I joined in 1992. The first 10 years, all of that good private sector experience really set me up to be effective and to be kind of uniquely suited to be a manager. Immediately I was supervising a big team of local staff in my press office. And I credit the Kellogg Company for giving me the tools to know how to do that.
Well, that's interesting, though, that was Colin Powell, because of course he was from the military, where management is, they really study that because that's the part of their success is managing well.
Well, that's right. And we didn't do enough of that as diplomats. And I think back in the old days, you really got ahead by who you knew rather than your innate ability.
Yeah.
And so we had done an overhaul maybe about 10 or 15 years ago to make sure that the people who were getting the deputy chief of mission positions, like the chief operating officer position in an embassy overseas, were actually qualified and had good interpersonal skills. Because before it was basically who had they worked with, were they a good political officer, so meaty policy issues. Well, that doesn't necessarily make you a good chief operating officer. You have to have an understanding of budgets, which again I brought in from the private sector, how you manage personnel, staffing, all of those things that can seem kind of boring, but that's the key to success in operations.
Amen to that. I can tell you, as an entrepreneur for a long time.
Yes.
You watch it all. Oh, golly. I love the fact how you have combined your inner desire for that international work, and then to bring it through the private sector. I love it. I'm encouraged by that, because I remember I brought my grandson to Italy when he was about 12. And that was the first time he had been in another country. And it was just so great to see how he reacted to a different culture, a different food, different language. Mm. It's a dream of mine to have really many, many, many more children have that opportunity early on. Oh, well.
Well, I do think it's important, because we were raised in America to think that our way is the way things should be done. And so it's good to get exposure to other parts of the world to realize there's lots of different ways to live. There's different roles, there's different priorities. My favorite was when I lived in China. My Chinese teacher told me basically it's not a riddle, but it's a situation. So they said, you're on a ferry, the ferry runs into problems and starts sinking. You have your spouse, your mother, and your child. Who do you save? And in the United States, of course, we would save our child. We'd say, the mother's had a good life, the husband or the wife can fend for themselves, but child is vulnerable, you must save the child. And my Chinese teacher said, no, in China, you save your mother. You can get another spouse, you can have another child, but you only have one mother.
Oh. Yes, the Chinese have a particularly different way of viewing how they sit within society. I was so impressed with a family that I met when I was working there for a while, and how proud they were that the country had fed 2 billion people.
Yes.
I mean, it was like, we wouldn't even think of that in this country. I was very impressed with that.
Yes. Well, and also that they had launched a satellite, which again, for us is not very significant, because we just grew up all having satellites. But for them, it was very significant. They didn't have to rely on the United States or anybody else. Yeah. I also found in terms of motivating staff in China, you shouldn't single anyone out for having done a good job. They hate that. They call that the kind of the nail problem, that you want to hit the nail down so that you're all equal. Because if you single out someone even for praise, which in the United States is something that people would really enjoy, it's shameful for them, and it causes them trouble, maybe envy from their colleagues. So you shouldn't do it. Mm. By the same token, when I was in Equatorial Guinea, the tribal relations and the concepts of the extended family meant nobody wanted to be wildly successful, because then they would have to take care of their entire family. And then if they weren't successful, they weren't worried, because their extended family would take care of them. So I thought, wow, how do you motivate these people? This is very different.
Very different. Thank you for that insight. Wow. Okay, well, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. In this country, we have images in our minds of key players. Every soldier is a soldier in uniform, standing straight and tall. every postman or postwoman, I always envision walking with a big sack of
Yes.
mail hanging from their shoulder. Um, every senator is sitting at her desk, with the U.S. flag standing behind. What kind of image should we have of a diplomat?
A diplomat is professionally dressed, striding towards their counterpart with their hand outstretched.
Aha!
We have a saying, it's the last 3 feet. So it's really important to close that last 3 feet, make that direct connection, and try to forge an understanding between the two people, the two countries, the two policies, to see where you can bridge gaps and really make connections.
That is beautiful because I racked my brain saying, well, okay, what could it possibly be?
Yes.
But that phrase, the last 3 feet, it just says it all, doesn't it?
Yes, it's not original. It's
Yeah.
but what we all learn. It's the most important is the last 3 feet.
Oh,
I mean, the other thing is sitting at these long tables with flags on both sides, having these interminable conferences. That's also part of it. But that is more for show. It's all the work that's been done behind the scenes ahead of time that's really the most important.
What was the most surprising relationship that you developed in your work?
And I've had a couple. My counterpart in Hong Kong, who worked for the Chinese mainland Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we were both the press officers. And I actually forged quite a good relationship with her because even though it was a little bit of a contentious time in Hong Kong, this is during post reversion to Chinese rule under their first chief executive, when there were protests after the severe acute respiratory syndrome, there were protests against a national security bill. And so it could have been quite heated between us. But we met each other regularly. And so I could understand what her concerns were. And then I could share how the United States viewed things. And I thought that was an important relationship to have. I also, when I was in Thailand, a Thai who had worked for the U.S. Embassy as a local staff and then went to work for the Thai military in a military academy. She was also a good contact of mine that I had a monthly get together with, because she really gave me insight on how the Thai military was trained and what their priorities were. And you'd think usually that wouldn't be something a press officer would have insight into. And it was just such a fascinating window on this country that from the outside, we don't really think of Thailand having a super robust military because they're in this neighborhood with ASEAN where they don't have a lot of conflicts. Now, just recently, we've seen Thailand and Cambodia go at it against each other. But it was important for me to get those insights, and this is like 30 years ago, which I wouldn't have been expected to have. And I would also say my last posting in Myanmar, I worked with my ambassadorial and chief of mission counterparts from all embassies. So a lot of times maybe you think the Americans would work with the Europeans, but from the Saudi and the Bangladesh and the Cambodian ambassadors and the Vietnamese ambassador to the Australian, New Zealand, French, etc. It was a very collaborative and inclusive environment because we were all trying to figure out different parts, particularly with the Indian ambassador, those that had access to the de facto authorities in Naypyidaw, and then those of us who didn't, good to compare notes. So that too was a refreshing change.
Ah, fabulous. Well, let's say you have a young person and they want to consider becoming a member of the diplomatic service. What should they be studying? Now, before you answer that, I want to tell you, I coached a young woman who wanted to become an international lawyer. She was 16 at the time. And I thought, that's amazing that she has such clarity, right? And I was coaching her on helping her decide which college to go to. And I said, is there something additional that you would want? And she really didn't know at the time. But then I said, how about if we get you to talk to somebody who actually is an international lawyer? She thought that was wonderful. So I set it up, and we had an hour with this gentleman, and he was wonderful with her, absolutely wonderful. And she asked the most surprising question, which leads me back to why I wanted to interject this story. She asked him, what should I study in high school to become a good lawyer? And he answered that instantly. He said, learn to write good English. And I thought, I would never have asked that question. And yet here is an incredibly useful piece of information for this young woman. So with that.
Well, I would say that is good advice for diplomacy as well, because a lot of the work of diplomats is reporting. And so it's, in essence, writing a newspaper or magazine article. What are the insights that we see on the ground? So you have to be a fast, cogent, organized writer with good grammar, et cetera. So that is very important. I would also say a study of history, U.S. history, if we're talking high school, study U.S. history, especially advanced placement U.S. history, because it goes in a little bit more detail of what's going on. And then at the university level, international relations, again, history. I of course, was a business major, but in my dual degree, I did French political science, which was very helpful. But I also did Russian history, Chinese history as electives. Mm-hmm. And those courses were very helpful to me once I decided to change careers and go into the diplomatic service. But the diplomatic service does not, in the United States, does not even require a university degree. It only requires you to pass the entrance exam, which is the written exam. Then there's an oral exam and a group exercise. And of course, it's been changed since I took the exam back in 1990. But when it was almost like a Trivial Pursuit series of multiple choice questions, but then there was a grammar section at the end that's very important. I will say the only people I've ever met that didn't have advanced degrees or college degrees were naturalized Americans from the UK, where I think it is much more common to go into kind of an apprenticeship stream and then think of yourself as being able to be a professional. But that's not to say that somebody raised in the United States couldn't do it. It's just more helpful if you do have that degree because you've got more knowledge. And I would say a lot of people coming into diplomacy were lawyers or English teachers or had gone and studied international relations. Again, when I joined as a business professional, it was very unusual. I think it's much more common now, but not least because there's a big difference in your salary when you are in the private sector and when you join as an entry level in diplomacy. Once you are at a more senior level and you're overseas, your housing is taken care of. Your child's school is, the school fees are taken care of. And so the package is quite competitive with the private sector. But I know back in Washington and boy, that first paycheck after I left the private sector, it was quite a difference.
Yeah. Well, you never mentioned language. You don't have to speak another language?
It is helpful. So it is helpful to have lived abroad, and you could do a summer abroad, maybe travel, but I think it's helpful to have lived abroad to know, are you adaptable? Mm-hmm. And then speaking a foreign language is helpful. You are taught foreign languages once you get into the Foreign Service, but it's helpful to show that you've got an aptitude. I did join in a class with a colleague that had fluent Italian because his family was Italian American, but he didn't do very well on the language aptitude test. And we all thought that was so crazy because he spoke fluent Italian, but maybe it was just through osmosis that he picked up the Italian and would have difficulties with other languages. And I, for example, came in with fluent French, but they gave us this language aptitude test. It's not a prerequisite that you speak a foreign language to get into the Foreign Service. And once we were already hired, we did this aptitude test. And because I scored highly, I think that's why they eventually sent me to Thailand, which is a more challenging tonal language. But it isn't part of the test.
Interesting. Interesting. So you could, if I hear you right, you could go into the Foreign Service directly from school.
Yes. In fact, I had a classmate that went in as a 21-year-old with no work experience. I wouldn't say that that is optimal because I did really benefit from having some work experience before.
Yeah.
And it also helped focus me on what I wanted out of a career.
Mhm.
So I knew that I wasn't going to be motivated just by trying to make money. I knew I wanted to do something that I thought was important. And you'll find a lot of diplomats are very mission driven. Particularly our brethren at the U.S. Agency for International Development, but also people at the State Department and even the Commerce Department. If you're in Foreign Agricultural Service too, if you're in the Foreign Service, it's so disruptive to your life that you really need to be looking at what the motivation is, and it is the mission of trying to make the world a better place for America and help advance the policy priorities of whichever administration is in charge.
Mission driven. So, as a young person, no, let me put that differently. Yes, if as a young person you express an interest, it would be good for a parent to really query that, to see what their rationale is. Because from what you're saying, you almost need to have a certain value set in order to be able to thrive.
Because it's a career where you have less, let's say, control over lots of factors. So you can express preferences of where you would like to work. For example, they'll give you a list when you first join. Here are the positions that are open. Where would you like to go? Do you want to go to the Middle East, to Europe, to Asia, to Latin America, to Africa? And then based on that, you might have as your top choice, I want to go to, I don't know, Accra, Ghana. And then you end up in Asuncion in South America. So you need to be prepared for that. You're going to Poland. You got to learn a new language that you might not use for any other posting that you have. Once you get assigned and you arrive at the post, you are assigned housing. You don't get to choose where you're going to live, except in certain limited cases where they give you an allowance and you go find it yourself. Otherwise, they say, here are the keys to your house, apartment, and that's where you're going to be. And so you have to be adaptable, and you also have to be ready every three years or so. You have to uproot your life. So it means dragging your kids out of their school system, out of taking their friends away. If you have a spouse with a private sector career or any type of career, they've got to find a new job. And then the little things you don't think about, the dentist, your hair salon, who's your doctor going to be? All those things you've got to find all over again. Where's the dry cleaning? And so you have to like change, and you have to be receptive to learning new things, and you've got to be curious. But I would say it's very rewarding.
I want to ask you what you felt was the most rewarding from what you did.
Well, part of it was leading teams that were successful. So helping in endeavors that, you're asked to do things. So for example, the White House came to us and said, we want to set up with no additional funding, a leadership program for young Southeast Asian youth. So leaders, and figure out how you're going to do it. And so then we had to get together and think about, all right, well, what would that look like? What's important? We decided having an identity that's linked to the Association for Southeast Asian Nations. So this is a group of now 11 countries in Southeast Asia, to get them all to work together and collaborate as a bloc, not just individual countries. And so we arranged the program with existing funds that were already allocated by Congress for exchange programs to bring over participants from all, used to be 10, now 11 countries, to go either study or do these internships together in the United States, come all together in Washington, but then importantly for us to do regional events where they would have to collaborate and they could compete for grants and things, but it has to be from more than one country to really forge this ASEAN identity. And I was really gratified to to have the 10th anniversary of this program. I presided over the one we celebrated in Myanmar when I was the chief of mission, and I got to tell the young participants of this group. It was called the Young Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative, or YSEALI. I got to tell them I was part of the team that created it, and I was at the first ever event for it, where we brought people together, including another one where the president came and talked to them in Malaysia. So that was very rewarding.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes.
I love it when you can touch many, many people,
right,
with a single thread. Oh,
yes,
beautiful.
Well, and that's important because, as I said, like a lot of things you don't see success in. You're not going to suddenly in 3 measly years make big breakthroughs. So you got to be happy with those types of successes.
Yeah, great. Well, you're retired now. So what's your next act? I know you've written a book. Has that been published?
Oh, no, I haven't written a book. So I have been interviewed for a couple of different analyses, think pieces on Myanmar, and I did a podcast on Myanmar when I first got back, because of course the insights and still so fresh in my mind. I am working with the Association of Diplomatic Studies and Training to help document oral histories of former diplomats. And then I'm looking at whether I want to pursue full-time work. I know you and I have discussed that, and you have urged me to continue to do something. But right now I am enjoying being back in the United States, closer to family and friends, and trying to figure out what I want to do next. Oh. It is it's a hard career to follow up because it is so unique, and you can get so much done that everything else kind of pales in comparison.
Yes. It's similar when you work at the World Bank.
Yes, I imagine it. I imagine it is a very similar career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you can keep going and still have impact. That's the good news.
Yes, and you're a role model for doing that.
Thank you. What's the question that you would like to have been asked and I didn't ask you?
I guess in terms of what is the biggest challenge? And I would say when you first arrive in a country and you've got the classroom knowledge of the language, and you have to quickly get up to speed to understand the operating environment to be able to be a functional member of the team. And we do this continually. And so we're very good at kind of parachuting in and trying to figure out the lay of the land. But I would say it's always a challenge. You get in, you usually don't know, anybody at the embassy where you're going to be working. As you get more senior, you do tend to find that colleagues that you've worked with before. But usually you're just going in and you're trying to figure this out. And you try to draw on the experience of your last post, but a lot of times it's not a transferable skill. I mean, there's certain things that you can draw upon, general management issues, but the mindset of one country is not necessarily the mindset of another. And I think that is a big challenge. And I think also people don't realize, because it's a public service career, how much work being a diplomat is. You're on a different time zone than Washington, but you're at Washington's beck and call. So you are on calls particularly when I was in mainland China, I was on a call at midnight. When I was in Myanmar, I was in a virtual meeting with the White House up until like 1:30 in the morning at a time when there's a curfew. And so it's a little dangerous to move about the city. But this is just part of the job. And you are constantly traveling, supporting congressional delegations, high-level U.S. executive branch members. I remember in Beijing at one point we had the Deputy Secretary of State, so the number 2. We had the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Health and Human Services and a major earthquake all the same week. And I was the press attaché, so I had to manage all of them. It's just a lot of work that I think people think, oh, you're swanning around at cocktail parties, and that's not it.
Oh, goodness. Well, I have just so appreciated this conversation. It's made what my study has been about diplomacy real. It now has a little texture on it. So I really appreciate this time together. We always thank our military men and women by saying thank you for your service. So I'd like to say to you, thank you, Ambassador Susan Stevenson, for your service.
Thank you very much, Madelyn. We're not shot at, so I can see why the military deserves more appreciation than we do. But I do think we are the second unsung heroes of the American public overseas that they don't see, and that's fine. But we do want, particularly when Congress comes time to fund us, that they need to know that diplomacy is important.
Thank you. Every now and then, there is something that changes how I think about the world. Grounds for Thought is a place where I talk about these moments so that you can explore the meaning for yourself. Roger Fisher said, good negotiations don't focus on positions. They focus on interests. My father and I disagreed on some things. For example, I wanted to create flower beds in the lawn, and he wanted only grass so that mowing was easier. Some of those disagreements seemed to go away, but I never knew how. It was years later that I realized it was my mother who had quiet conversations with my father. Oh, I suspect there was more to it, but as far as I was concerned as a kid, it was done invisibly, and it was done well. I never thought of it as diplomacy. Yet the more I learned about conflict resolution, negotiation, and diplomacy, the more I understood my mother's approach. Today, when anyone has a disagreement, I find myself wishing they could just call my mother and tell her to go and talk to the other people to get things straightened out. As I look at some of the issues today, I wondered if there were cases where an intermediary, someone like my mother, stepped in or arranged for someone else to step in to talk between the parties. There were cases aplenty. In this case, finding the examples of successful, quiet diplomacy involves nations, of course. And before I describe it, I need to say that Unlocked has never ventured into politics. I do not consider myself sufficiently expert to provide the informed hosting role that I play here. So what I report here is from research into the literature. And I selected each case because it was one that is recognizable and exemplary. And I will also say in advance that my source was the Council on Foreign Relations. I arbitrarily stopped my research at 4 situations. All were situations where it was quiet diplomacy that resolved things. And I'll mention 3 of them and then give you a little bit more detail on the 4th. First one, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. The Belfast Agreement came through back channels that almost no one knew existed, where the interlocutor became the only person through which the parties would communicate. One person. Nixon and Kissinger and the opening to China in 1971, where Kissinger and Nixon kept their back channel negotiations entirely to themselves. Then there were the Oslo Accords of 1993 that settled Israel and the PLO, where secret negotiations were brokered by Norway, necessarily hidden due to a law that prohibited an Israeli from having contact with the PLO. Now, for one with more detail. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed regime in Havana and established a socialist state allied with the Soviet Union. And for 50 years, the US administrations, through policy initiatives, isolated the Caribbean island economically and diplomatically. But in 2014, President Obama and Raul Castro announced their governments would restore full diplomatic ties. In a White House statement, Obama said, "America chooses to cut loose the shackles of the past so as to reach for a better future for the Cuban people, for the American people, and for our entire hemisphere, and for the world," unquote. But it's the backstory that is so telling. Over the 50 years prior, Third-party nations such as Brazil, Mexico, and Spain had repeatedly served as quiet intermediaries. The announcement from Obama and Castro was the culmination of 18 months of secret diplomacy brokered by Pope Francis. Now, not with the Pope, but brokered by him. Sometimes we just need a third party who has the interest of both sides to create a safe space for the conversation to happen. Good negotiations and good negotiators don't focus on positions, they focus on interests. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope this conversation has offered you just new ideas, one perhaps that restores attention, maybe connection, and maybe even the capacity to learn. And if you're on YouTube, please click the like button and subscribe. Of course, it helps me, but it also helps other people trying to find this kind of information, especially at depth. I'm Madelyn Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilient leader.